everyone, it's Annabelle and welcome back to my channel. In today's video we're going to be repotting a load of new orchids, plus doing a 1-month update showing the conversion to semi-hydro, the adaptation, and how they do along that time frame. We're going to be starting off with just 2 orchids, the Prosyclia Purple Lace and the Prosyclia Purple Streams. The Prosyclia Purple Lace, you can see here, came to me in bloom. It's beautifully plump and it was very shriveled when I got it. Those shrivels have never come out of the pseudobulbs despite rehydration and a good root system. So it is just going to remain shriveled, but you can see that the creases are already kind of plumped out just from a day's soaking. So the first things first, when I get an orchid, I soak it for at least a few hours, if not a full day, in a nutrient mix, which consists of my normal rain mix, which has really good amounts of calcium and magnesium in. Alternatively, you could just do a CalMag soak, and I add seaweed into that nutrient mix. So we're going to start off with the Prosyclia Purple Lace. So I think for optimal adaptation, you should soak the orchid for a few hours to get nutrients, calcium, magnesium particularly, into the orchid, and also seaweed I believe is beneficial to kickstart growth. The flowers on this are absolutely beautiful. They did only last a few days, unfortunately, and they're already fading, but you can expect that when you buy an orchid in flower and it goes through shipping and transit. So I'm going to be repotting these and doing a really detailed look at the repot with you guys and just talking through each step. I thought that that might be helpful. So we're going to just focus in on how I remove bark from the roots to start with. So this is a mix of fine and chunky bark, and the roots are very well attached. To remove bark from the roots, I simply pinch my fingernail just below the root area and gently prise it off. This way the bark will come off as long as it's been soaked thoroughly, without taking any of the root volumen with it. And I believe that this is key to a successful adaptation to semi-hydro and not losing the old root system when you transition, which is always a risk. So ideally you should wait for new growth before starting a repot of any kind, not just semi-hydroponics, because the old roots sometimes fail to adapt to the medium change, particularly if they were damaged during the repot. And it's best to have a new growth with new roots waiting and ready to take over if that does happen and the old root system fails. So I've got the bark off, the large chunks of bark, and I'm just going to see what from this medium actually just falls off by gently brushing it through and kind of detangling the roots like you would hair almost. And any media that comes off straight away and easily, obviously that saves you quite a bit of time, and then you can really use your time wisely, focusing in on the little bits of bark or charcoal or whatever's really attached to the root. Just really taking your time and approach each root individually rather than looking at the whole mess and thinking, oh, this is a bit overwhelming and this is going to get damaged and this is going to be difficult. I like to just kind of look at each root and take my time, and it becomes much less of an obstacle that way, and I find that my success has definitely increased since I started kind of just gently taking my time, looking at each root and trying my best to save each root rather than trying my best to save the whole root system, if that makes sense. So I've got most of the large bark and small bark off of these. I'm just going to pinch that last bit off, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this to the sink and pop it under a tap on high, and that'll dislodge a lot of the rest, and I'll just do that kind of gentle brushing through motion under the tap, and that gets off most of what's left. This was potted in a mix of bark and little bits of charcoal, so the root system is quite stained. There are little bits of bark left on there, but we're just going to leave them on. I'm going to remove any dried sheaths and bracts because they can hold on to moisture and create a soggy kind of environment around the new growths. They can also be a great environment for molds and bacteria, fungi to kind of breed in because they're dead material, and fungi love to feed on dead material, and those aren't necessarily the pathogenic types of fungi that would cause rot, but at the same time, if you've got an ideal environment for one type of fungi, you're then also giving a good environment for another. So I just like to limit the amount of material that's in there that can rot, such as organic material, medium, and bracts and sheaths. So to start off with, I place the orchid into the pot, which I've pre-filled with leca to above the drainage holes, the flushing holes that we have in our pot, in our semi-hydroponic pot, and I place the orchid on top of where the reservoir would sit. So none of the new roots are sitting in or on the reservoir line. This gives us the best adaptation because those old roots aren't adapted to the kind of more moist environment in the pot. They're adapted to a specific air to moisture ratio, and they can adapt to some extent, but it's best not to push your luck with them. And one thing that you can do if you're struggling to adapt new orchids to semi-hydro is to actually keep them on the drier side. So fill the reservoir a bit and let them dry a little bit between waterings until they're pushing those new roots down into the medium. And this can just help the old roots to last a little bit longer while you're waiting for the new roots. Some orchids are more prone to losing the old root system than others, and I believe that this can be related to the amount of damage that the old root system sustains during the repot. Some Cattleyas and Cattleya family orchids are very prone to root loss after repotting. Some aren't, and the Encyclias and Prosthecheas I found don't tend to be, and this is a hybrid between the two. They also, in my climate, do very well in just plain leca, so this is what I'm potting this orchid into, and I'm then going to put a more moisture retentive top layer on. So I'm now happy with the position of the orchid in the pot. I tend to pot more centrally to give plenty of room from both sides for growth, because although this has one direction of growth at the moment, what they can often do is sprout another direction of growth of the opposite side at some point as they become more mature. So in my opinion, I prefer to pot towards the centre rather than towards the back, just to account for if we do get another direction of growth happening. So I'm adding in a top layer of a mixture of leca, ceramis and lava rock and a bit of pumice, and these are all more moisture retentive materials that I'm adding into the top layer to see if we can get a better distribution of moisture in the pot. I may need to come back and add in a pebble top layer, but for now I'm going to see what my new mixes of medium can do to help me on their own with the top layer, because I've really found that lava rock is very moisture retentive in some media tests that I did. So I'm going to see how we go, and I can always come back in the update and add in a top layer of pebbles if we find that we need it. We may not. Some orchids have very sensitive roots to the dry top layer that you tend to get with semi-hydro, and some don't. And for some orchids, adding in more moisture retentive materials just to the top may be enough of a fix to get those roots down. For some, we might need to go back to my pebbles and see how we do with that. But I just wanted to try this out in the interest of kind of learning, because I'm constantly learning and trying to adapt my setups to what's best for different orchids in my environment. And I'm currently got all these different mediums that I'm trialing out. So I would like to kind of see if I can get away without using the top layer and just see how this does. So now what we're going to do is fast forward a month and do a 1 month update on this guy. So this is 1 month later. The Prosyclia purple lace flowers didn't last very long, but the root system did great in the new medium. It hasn't branched roots to the side of the pot just yet. It's remained quite plump. The new growth has matured quite a bit, and it did try putting some roots down, and unfortunately the dry top layer was too dry for those new root tips to get down into the medium. So I am coming in to intervene to add in some washed river gravel, and this is a non-porous top layer that will help those new roots to get down into the media. Otherwise doing very well. The old root system hasn't died off, we're just having some difficulties with that new root system. Otherwise the plant's doing very well and it's remained relatively plump, and that new growth has progressed along. So if we change the top layer now and add on some pebbles, I believe that it'll really help those new roots to get down into the medium. Often these new growths can produce quite a large number of new roots, so even though the first couple have dried, we've still probably got quite a lot of roots left in this new growth. So if we do this now, I think that this is a great time for it to still be able to recover and adapt well. It'll probably keep the existing root system though. It's just about getting those new roots down, because obviously the plant can't really progress if it can't get any new roots down. The old roots can branch to a certain extent and can keep it going, but to really become a mature specimen, with multiple directions of growth, loads of energy stores, we really need to be getting lots of new roots down. So this is the main issue that I've struggled with semi-hydro as a growing method with just leca as a substrate, which is why I introduced all these different inorganic materials. I think the fact that I assumed Cattleya care for this and put straight leca actually led to an issue with this, because I do know that my Encyclia cordigera prefers a way higher amount of moisture than normal Cattleya types, to the extent that it was potted in pure self-watering moss, and when I changed to inorganic it's now in a mixture of synthic and leca, and it just loves moisture. So I really should have expected this from this Encyclia cordigera hybrid. So we're going to add in a top layer and see if that helps it out. If not, then I can switch it to an Prossyclia mix that I found works for my cordigera, but really we want to be limiting the amount that we're taking this orchid out and changing the media. Every time you take an orchid out of the pot and alter the materials that it's in, you're introducing another stress that could ultimately lead to the failure of the orchid. So I really don't like to change media. I'd rather kind of tweak little things and see if I can get something to work than take the orchid out and put it in a whole new setup and force it to adapt yet again, which could lead to its early demise. So I think that's another reason semi-hydro can fail sometimes, is people kind of panic a little bit if roots die off. So I think timing is really critical if you're new to semi-hydro, to stop that kind of worry about the old root system. So just changing the top layer, I think at this point is the best option we have. And for me, for many orchids, this has been a really invaluable tool and a really great fix. So I'm just going to add in these non-porous, non-wicking pebbles to the top. These can't absorb water to the same extent as a porous or wicking material can, like Leca, Lava Rock, Ceramis, because they're just smooth, they don't have any pores to kind of suck water up through capillary action. So with these, they also function to provide a top layer that can remain dry and not desiccate root tips, but also they trap more moisture in the pot because they're not wicking moisture up from the wicking material that's in the pot. So the level of evaporation from the top of the media just below these pebbles is kind of halted, so you get a very moist line right up until these pebbles because they can't take the water from the next layer down and then evaporate it in the same way that a porous material could. So they kind of work in a twofold way to increase moisture within the pot while also providing a non-desiccating top layer. For most orchids, and for Cattleya types definitely, this works for me pretty much every time. For some orchids this is limited. Orchids that are like a really humid environment around new root tips, this doesn't always work for, but for many of my orchids this has been a really invaluable tool. So that is the Prosyclia purple lace, all potted up with a new pebble top layer, updated after a month. It's doing really great. Now we're going to move on to the Prosyclia purple streams, and we're going to go back to the original repotting here. So this is the Prosyclia purple streams. Has a beautiful flower which is quite different to the purple lace, so I'm very interested to actually flower this one and see the differences. It didn't come in flower at all, it came with an old spike. Fantastic root system, as you can see, literally holding the shape of the tiny little pot it was in, and the new roots from new growths have actually desiccated trying to get down because it kind of climbs slightly. So I'm going to be potting this one slightly at an angle. This is potted in a mix of bark and charcoal, and obviously we've got a very tightly bound root system, so I'm just going to kind of wiggle the root system to try and dislodge as much as possible of the old medium. None of it's particularly stuck to the roots in the same way that the previous Prosyclia had grabbed onto the bark. This is a finer medium, so I guess there's less opportunity for the roots to actually grab them. It's kind of a crushed charcoal and fine bark with a bit of moss from what I can see. There are some lovely new root tips here that have actually made it down into the medium, so I'm just being very, very careful not to break off those new growing tips. So again, I'm just kind of squeezing the material away from them, and that means that you can get it off without damaging the volumen too much. Although none of this is particularly stuck to the roots, it's kind of wedged in very tightly where the roots have all compressed the medium within the pot. And there is some form of either slow release fertilizer or snail pellet, something like that, in this medium. So they've obviously just put that in there mainly because there's predominantly charcoal in this mix, so it is almost an inorganic material. Charcoal kind of is like a halfway point between organic and inorganic, and it's not going to hold as much nutrients as normal bark would, I would think. I don't have a lot of experience with it and I've not used it very much, but all of these orchids did come potted in kind of charcoal heavy mixes and they all had great root systems, so it seems like it's a really great material. Obviously charcoal as well has detoxifying properties, and it's used in poison treatment as well to absorb kind of toxins from the body. So I guess as well it kind of maybe cleans the media slightly. Obviously it's not going to break down, it's probably got an alkaline pH from, I'm just guessing here, I've never tested it, but it probably also kind of mops up any toxins in the medium. Again, I'm just thinking out loud here. I've not got much in the way of experience with charcoal. Just going to rinse this off under the tap now that I've got most of the big media pieces out and cleaned it up. Just using the same kind of techniques as before in the previous repot. So that's all washed off. A lot of the little bits of charcoal have come off, leaving the root system really nice and clean, and it hasn't stuck to the roots in the same way as the bark did in the previous repot. Again, just going to take off some of these dried up bracts from around the base of the plant because they can kind of hold up moisture around the base of the plant, which we don't really want. We don't want to increase the chance of rot. There's a fine balance between keeping things moist for new root tips and keeping things too moist that can lead to fungal issues and rot and that sort of thing. So there's, with each orchid, this kind of fine balance that you need to achieve, and I think bracts are annoying in inorganic wicking systems, so I always try and remove them once they've dried up, just to reduce the amount of decaying material that's around the base of the pseudobulbs. Got a really great plant here, loads of pseudobulbs, really healthy, really great root system, so I think it'll adapt much quicker than the previous plant. Larger plants have more energy stored and tend to adapt much quicker in my experience. In addition to that, this isn't in flower, which the other one was. The other one is almost at a stalling point between flowering and growth, whereas this one is just purely in growth mode, so this should adapt much quicker, I believe. This is almost why I prefer getting orchids not in flower. Honestly, the flower doesn't last, it's never as good because it's been through shipping, it won't last very long, and the orchid is almost stuck in that flowering stage because it's been through this stress of transit. Not that orchids can't flower and grow at the same time when they're established in your care, absolutely they can, but when they're switching from one environment to the next, there tends to be like a tail off where they're stalling, they're kind of a little bit stressed from the transit and the transport and the new environment, and they're flowering, so they kind of tend to do nothing for a bit, think about their lives and then make a new growth. Whereas if you can get them still growing, it really just makes life so much easier. So I prefer not having orchids in flower. Everyone's got their own preference though, and then I prefer to kind of rebloom on my own. I think everyone does though. The flowers will last much longer, be much bigger, better quality and more fragrant if they're done in your care. So I just put a wick in the bottom of this pot. We're going for a self-watering pot this time, larger reservoir, bigger orchid, bigger root system, so we're really gonna want to maximize the amount of time between waterings because I anticipate this being quite a thirsty orchid given the size. So it's getting a bigger pot than the previous orchid, which was a smaller orchid with a smaller root system. Self-watering pots can be a slightly airier environment, which can work to your advantage, or it can be a disadvantage, increasing the amount of dryness at the top. So to combat this, what I'm doing is placing the wick slightly higher in the pot. The wick is responsible for transmitting moisture between the reservoir up to the pot. So you can use pretty much anything. I'm out of my usual cotton wicks, so I'm just using cut up microfiber towels, and that works great. Synthetic is also probably the best material I've got for wicks actually, but it's also quite expensive and I've run out, so I'm cutting up towels at the moment. So I've placed a layer of medium about halfway up in the pot, pulled the microfiber wick up over, so the wick is sitting about halfway up in the pot, and I'm pre-mixing my media to use in this because I'm going to be using it in a self-watering system, so I want a really even distribution of moisture through the pot. So instead of doing like lacquer and then a top layer, I'm going to be using a lot more moisture retentive materials mixed throughout the mix to try and really distribute that moisture evenly, because we've got an area medium, we've got an area potting system, so we want to provide a bit more moisture within the actual media. So I'm just going to mix up some large grade ceramis, lava rock and leca, and large grade ceramis and lava both hold quite a lot more moisture than leca, so this will give that more moisture balance within the pot to provide that air to moisture ratio that we're aiming for, which you can achieve in lots and lots of different ways. So I'm going to place this with the newer growths towards the centre of the pot. There is a chance that this could at any point sprout another direction of growth. It's a little bit of an awkward one because it's also climbing slightly. So I'm going to place the older, smaller growths towards the back of the pot, and we've got 3 directions of growth that I'm placing more towards the centre. This probably will need repotting in a year's time. By that point we'll be going into a much bigger pot and hopefully it'll have bloomed for me by then. So I'm just pouring the mixture of media into the pot and leveling it. Don't have to worry too much about any air gaps in this, just going to gently squeeze the pot to make sure that all the little gaps are filled up, because any big air gaps and air pockets will reduce the efficiency of the wicking system. So we do want air gaps in the pot, but we don't want big media gaps, because that'll mean that we're going to have more dryness around the top layer, which is what we're trying to avoid. And I'm going to put slightly more lava rock again on the top of this, just to try and hold a bit more moisture around the top layer. I'm potting it a little bit lower in the pot as well, which creates a kind of humidity shield, which can be a pro and a con. Again, you want to balance the amount of moisture that you're putting at the top of the pot, because then you can end up with mold issues, but I haven't actually experienced that yet. My main issue has been combating dryness, so I'm just going to pop mainly lava on the top and just see how that works. I'm really kind of playing around with different materials at the moment, which is why I'm doing things maybe a little bit inconsistently. I'm trying new things to see kind of what works best with these new materials, and also in my new environment, because I've learned everything that I've learned so far pretty much in my old environment, so I also might need to adjust things slightly for winter in the conservatory. So that's the orchid all potted up, and then fast forwarding 1 month, we're going to do the update, and as you can see, we've got some fantastic new roots emerging from those 3 new growths. So the new growths haven't had any issues putting new roots out, and the new roots haven't really had too many issues getting past the top layer. You can see that the top layer is a little bit dry, and we do have a few root tips that have shortened and shrunk, and one that has gone upwards and desiccated. So as the growing tip starts to shrink, it's kind of a warning sign that things are getting a bit dry. Within the pot, the old root system has survived, thrived, branched, continued growing like nothing happened, as you can see here. So we've not got any root loss from the old root system, and we've got those fantastic new roots going down into the pot. So I'm very confident that this orchid will continue to do very well in this setup. I think we've hit on a good balance of air to moisture within the pot for this particular orchid. The dry layer is staying a little bit dry because we've got a few shrunk root tips and 1 desiccated root tip. So what I'm going to do is actually add some pebbles onto the top of this layer as well. I left plenty of room on both of these instances, just in case I needed to add in some pebbles, and I think I do. So I'm just going to add in some smooth washed river pebbles again, just to the top, just to really kind of make sure that those new root tips are all going down and not struggling with porous top layers. And that, I think, for me is a real issue, the porous nature of top layers, regardless of whether they're kind of lava or leca. Although you can see the roots that have settled on the lava on the left here are actually, the root tips look great, they look healthy, they look strong, and they look like they're going to keep going, whereas the ones on the leca on the right, the root tips have shrunk, which indicates that they're about to desiccate and dry out and stop growing. So we need to rectify that. This is my constant kind of struggle, as you guys know. I'm going to add some river pebbles onto the top to prevent this issue, and that'll just help those new root tips to get down past the drier leca top layer. So those pebbles are all added on, and I left a really good amount of room before so that I could do this without disturbing the orchid. So these orchids have had minimal disturbance at this update stage. I've literally just added in a pebble top layer. The top layer of the polished river gravel really just helps to stop new roots desiccating when they hit that top layer, so they can get down to a more moisture retentive layer underneath that hasn't evaporated all that moisture. It's kind of holding on to it a little bit better. So that is my very detailed repot session for my 2 Prosyclias, and I will be doing a full repot session for all of the other orchids that I got in this haul as well, to kind of show you how I do things differently for different types of orchids. We've got some Renanthera, Arides, a Rinca Stylus and an Engracum to come still in this repot session, where we'll be kind of taking a detailed look and then doing updates. I hope that you found this kind of format and the detailed discussion interesting and useful. My aim is to try and really make things very clear about what I'm doing and the reasons for what I'm doing. So if there's anything that I've not made clear, then just let me know down below, and I always do my best to reply to every single comment. If I do miss it, sometimes YouTube hides comments from me, so bear with me. I usually try and fish them out and reply to everybody. And I really appreciate you watching today, and if you're interested in seeing more, don't forget that my Arides and Engracum and my Renanthera will be repotted in the next part in depth, so don't forget to subscribe to my channel so you don't miss that, and give this video a like if you did enjoy this video and found it useful. And I hope that I'll see you soon on the next repot. If you're watching this later, then at this end screen I will link the next repot so you can go straight on to that. Thank you so much for spending your time with me today and watching this video, and I hope to see you later. Have a great day and happy growing. Bye!